right, so we got some new polling data coming out of Fox News, of all places, which is giving, I guess, somewhat surprising results, although I don't think that this should be that surprising given the current breakdown of our neoliberal capitalist hellscape that we call a country here in the United States. But here from Mediaite, they're saying that in a new poll, a majority of Democrats favor the United States moving towards socialism and away from capitalism. So, first of all, and this is absolutely a good thing in my opinion for obvious reasons. I'm a socialist political commentator, so obviously I'm going to have a positive interpretation of this, but let's just go ahead and get into some of the details and I'll give you guys a little bit more of my thoughts on this. So, they say a majority of Democrats favor the country moving towards socialism, according to a Fox News survey conducted from October 9th to the 12th. They say in the poll, participants were asked whether they believe the United States is moving away from capitalism and towards socialism. I wish, but that is just not really true, right? We are much more firmly on the track towards fascism than we are towards actual socialism, but I guess a majority of Democrats believe that we are on the track towards socialism, which, could be interpreted in a multitude of different ways. But they say, according to the data, 54% believe that the country is headed towards socialism and only 38% disagree. They say this is a rise from 51% and 47% in 2012 and 2011, respectively. So I think that this kind of makes sense if you're looking at the years here that they're talking about comparing this to, because obviously, after Barack Obama, we had Bernie Sanders, who did two unsuccessful presidential runs in 2016 and 2020, and obviously popularized the idea or the concept of democratic socialism. So when you're looking at this data, right, you have to understand, number one, we are obviously living in the United States of America, okay? We are the center for global capitalism. We live in a country where socialism, communism, even just union participation has been demonized and propagandized against, and people have been misinformed for decades in this country, if not over a century at this point. So, you have to take this with that sort of lens of analysis and understand that when Americans or when Democrats are responding to a poll like this and saying whether or not they believe we're headed towards socialism, or say whether or not they support moving towards socialism, they're not really talking about socialism in a Marxian sense or socialism in what I would mean by socialism, right? When I talk about socialism, I'm talking about fully implementing economic democracy, right? Giving workers control over the means of production, having a democratic process to determine our economic future, and giving people more control over their day-to-day lives and their destiny, basically, right? And in addition to that, obviously socializing basic life necessities like housing and education and transportation and healthcare and food, all of the basic life necessities, right? That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about socialism, right? But you have to understand that Americans overwhelmingly don't really understand what socialism or capitalism or any of these labels really mean at a fundamental level. So they're basically, in my opinion, probably just referring to socialism as in when the government does stuff for you, right? So the sort of more Bernie Sanders style of socialism, right? And so, it's obviously going to be a positive thing that more and more people are trending towards that direction, or think that we should be moving in that direction. But also you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, because they're not really talking about real true socialism and what socialist theorists and economists would be talking about. They're talking about American style basic socialist reforms, or passing something like a Medicare for all, right? Or supporting unions and stuff like that. So that's how I'm kind of interpreting this polling data. I definitely don't think that a majority of Democrats are out and out Marxists or anything like that. So let's just go ahead and continue with some of the details here. They say respondents in the poll were also asked if they favor moving in the direction of socialism. Broken down by party lines, a majority of Democrats say that they do, while just about all Republicans do not. Okay, really not that surprising, but they say while only 32% of respondents overall believe a move towards socialism is a good thing, 53% of Democrats say that it's a good thing, according to this poll, and just over a third of polled Democrats believe that it's a bad thing. So you have pretty much a disproportionately and overwhelming plurality or majority of Democrats who say it's a bad thing. Only a third of them say that it's a good thing. Only a third of them say that it's a bad thing. So, that's a pretty positive development here, right? With all of the propaganda that is pushed by not only Republicans, but also Democrats as well. Kind of surprising that this is the result that we're ending up with. I guess it shouldn't really be that surprising, honestly, because because, again, the current state of the capitalist system that we have here in the United States right now, I mean, we can get into how absolutely horrific that is for just average working class people. But we continue here. They say, while 83% of Republicans oppose socialism and another 14% approve of socialism. Honestly, I'm surprised that 14% of Republicans approve of socialism, right? I mean, this is the party that is basically at this point like openly calling themselves Christian nationalists and openly saying, okay, maybe we should like dabble a little bit in fascism and just completely disregard this whole democracy thing, right? Even not even talking about like socialism in a true sense, but just disregarding like democracy in and of itself. So, I mean, it's kind of surprising that like 14%, over 1 in 10 Republicans are somehow Republicans, but also in favor of socialism. That's not really computing in my mind there, but again, kind of plays into this idea that like Americans don't really understand what socialism is in the first place. But they say among independents, 24% believe transitioning towards socialism and away from capitalism is a good thing, while 63% see it as bad. Again, honestly, not really surprised by those numbers that a majority would see it as a bad thing. But they say also broken down by party in Fox News' polling was the message Democrats and Republicans would currently send to the government, with the choices being lend me a hand or leave me alone. Okay, so this is where we really get to what I think most Americans like interpret the word socialism to mean, inaccurately so, but regardless, I think this is what we're dealing with here. So when they're talking about like whether or not people support the government helping them out in certain ways, right? We've had a couple of different examples of that in recent history under Joe Biden. We had the stimulus checks that went out. We've had a couple different bills that have mildly improved people's material conditions temporarily, at least. The unemployment insurance, the enhanced unemployment insurance, and all of that stuff. So we've had like tiny little examples where the government is stepping in and granted like relatively giving working class people crumbs compared to what we've given out to corporate America, especially over this pandemic period and this inflation period. But I mean, obviously it seems like a vast majority of people want the government to do more for them, right? Want to take more control out of the hands of the private capitalist sector. So on that front, they say among Democrats, 69%, nice, said that they want the government to lend them a hand, while only 26% responded that they wanted the government to leave them alone. And for Republicans, only 30% wanted a hand, and 60% were ready to tell the government to get off their backs, whatever the fuck that means. I mean, this is one of my, main critiques of the Republican Party and the rhetoric that they use surrounding issues like freedom and government oppression, is that when they make arguments like, the government is oppressive, the government wants to control more aspects of your life, what they're really talking about is gutting social spending programs like Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, all things that are going to be on the table in the immediate future if Republicans take back power. They're basically talking about like gutting those programs that benefit millions or tens of millions of Americans across this country and are like a lifeline for people, even though they're, milquetoast and they're not enough, in my opinion. But what they're basically talking about when they say that they want the government to get off their back is they're saying we are going to defund, we are going to gut these social safety nets in order to give more of that power over to the capitalist class. We're going to push for things like privatization. But what does that really mean at a fundamental level, right? Because I understand why some conservatives, have this idea that like the government is bloated, the government is bureaucratic and it's dysfunctional and all of that. To some extent, that's definitely true. But the follow-up question to that would be, who is corrupting these programs? Why are these programs so bloated and dysfunctional? And often the case is that you have private interests that bribe politicians, that infiltrate their way into our government. I mean, our government at this point, both parties across party lines are essentially entirely beholden to corporate America, and they intentionally sabotage these programs, right? And so, when Republicans are talking about getting the government off their back, what they're really talking about is putting the unchecked authoritarian capitalist system onto your back, right? So it's like a trade-off here, right? If you don't like government programs, okay, whatever, but you have to think about the alternative, right? If you don't want a, for example, government-run health insurance plan like Medicare for All, well, the alternative to that is you basically just have a private for-profit health insurance mafia that gets to completely dictate your healthcare, that gets to say which hospitals, which doctors, which medications are covered under their programs, which ones aren't, how much you're going to have to pay out of pocket for premiums, deductibles, co-pays, all of that shit. And you have no democratic say through the government whatsoever, no check on their power in any way, shape, or form. And that's what leads to a truly like bloated and dysfunctional and corrupted program, right? You look at our healthcare system right now, 500,000 medical bankruptcies a year, between 40 to 60,000 Americans die every year because they can't get access to adequate healthcare services. And, people are getting bankrupted, and all of these things are just unattainable for tens of millions of Americans. And so it's like, you have to look at the alternatives here, even when you're granting the idea that some of the government is bloated and corrupt and dysfunctional and it's never going to be perfect. Even understanding that, you also have to understand the alternatives that are on the table. So that's kind of my takeaway from that. And, I think that there's just a real misunderstanding in this country in terms of like what the government should be responsible for doing versus, what would be benefited by having the government run certain programs versus what would be beneficial for, so-called like free market principles and stuff like that. But they finish off here saying that among respondents overall, 52% said that they would ask the government to lend them a hand, so a majority here, and 43% wanted to be left alone. And Fox noted that this is a drop from 47% of people polled telling the government to leave them alone last year. So it seems like, obviously as people's material conditions are continuing to worsen over time, especially with inflation recently, people want the government to do something, right? They want the government to step in and give them a hand on some of these issues. So, my main takeaway from this, although I think it is overall positive news that a majority of Democrats favor their specific understanding of whatever socialism means as opposed to capitalism. Really, I'm interpreting this less of an outright endorsement of what I mean by socialism and more of a condemnation in terms of how big of a failure our current capitalist system is, right? Again, we just talked about the numbers on healthcare, but this applies to every single other aspect of average working class Americans' lives, right? People are getting shafted on the rent because we have so many gigantic, billion, if not trillion-dollar Wall Street firms that are gobbling up the housing supply and ripping people off, making what is, supposed to be a core integral part of the so-called American dream, owning a house for yourself and your family, completely unattainable for a majority of the country. And, price gouging people on rent. We have people getting price gouged on gas prices by billion-dollar fossil fuel corporations who are making record profits right now. You could apply this to any single industry across the country. And I do think that it's really notable here in terms of what the Americans' opinions are, that, we are living in a country that for basically the entire modern existence of it has been the most violent and the most powerful force against socialism around the world, right? Against communism around the world. We have waged wars over this, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. So many different examples, CIA operations and toppling democratically elected left-wing governments and, all of this on top of the Red Scare and on top of continuing, propaganda coming out of corporate media, propaganda coming out of both of the leadership classes of the Republican and the Democratic Party, just relentless propaganda against socialism as if it is this, grand evil that has just been a destructive force around the planet and that capitalism is this perfect system that we need to stand by. But even with all of that, you still have a majority of Democrats saying that we should be moving towards their idea of socialism. And I think that's a really positive thing because you just have to take that, with the understanding that we are living in the center of the most powerful capitalist force in the history of the country, right? With all of these different arms of propaganda and violence that are wielded by it on a regular basis. And still, even with all of that, this system has been such a abject failure for a vast majority of working class people that they're still wanting to try alternative things, whatever form that may take in their minds. So, this is definitely an overwhelmingly positive thing. We've seen other polling data that sort of corroborates this. And, especially among younger generations, among my generation of people, there's definitely more of a true understanding of what these concepts, what these words mean. You're talking about generations that got shafted by the '08 financial crash and now the 2020 crash as well. And people who have just been growing up in an era where it's no longer like the post-World War II economic boom era that our parents or grandparents or whatever were living through, where you had, some stability for middle-class Americans, and you had this, American dream, as they called it, that was actually somewhat attainable for, a large percentage of the population. And now you just have this, post-Reagan neoliberal collapse of the American economy, the American manufacturing base, and the middle class here in this country. And people are seeing all of this happen, especially my generation growing up with just failure after failure after failure and crash after crash after crash, and the government consistently just standing behind corporate America and Wall Street. And so it's of course, people are going to start rejecting this system that has just completely abandoned them, and they're going to be looking for viable alternatives.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying